It was one of those cold gray afternoons in London, when the sky looks like it might rain but never actually does, and everyone walks a little faster than usual trying to get somewhere warm. The train station was packed with people rushing in every direction, and nobody really looked at anyone else because that is just how big cities work, and everyone has somewhere to be and no time to stop. In the corner of the main hall, there was an old piano that had been sitting there for years, and it was one of those public pianos that anyone could play if they wanted to. And most days someone would sit down and bang out a few notes or play something simple, and people would walk past without even turning their heads. The piano itself had seen better days, and the black paint was chipped in places, and some of the keys had turned yellow with age, and there were scratches all over the wood from years of use by strangers passing through on this particular afternoon. A man walked slowly through the crowd, and he moved differently than everyone else because while they were all rushing, he was taking his time, like he had nowhere special to be. He looked to be somewhere in his late 50s or maybe early 60s, and it was hard to tell exactly because life had clearly been difficult for him, and his face showed every bit of that struggle. His coat was old and worn and had patches on the elbows, and his shoes were scuffed and dirty, and his gray hair was a bit too long and messy, like he hadn't been to a barber in months. He carried a small bag over his shoulder, and it looked like it contained everything he owned in the world, which wasn't much at all. Security guard near the entrance watched him carefully, the way security guards always watch people who look like they don't quite belong, and the guard was ready to move if the man caused any trouble. But the man wasn't causing trouble, and he was just walking slowly through the station, looking around at all the people rushing past him like he was from another world entirely. Then his eyes landed on the old piano in the corner, and something changed in his face, and it was like he had seen an old friend he hadn't spoken to in many years. He stood there for a long moment just staring at the instrument, and people pushed past him, annoyed that he was standing in the middle of the walkway, but he didn't seem to notice them at all. A woman in an expensive business suit bumped his shoulder as she rushed by, and she didn't apologize. And she didn't even look back, and he didn't react because his attention was completely fixed on that piano. Slowly he walked toward it, and each step seemed to take effort, like he was fighting against something inside himself, and like part of him wanted to turn around and walk away. A group of teenagers sitting on a bench nearby noticed him approaching the piano, and one of them elbowed his friend and pointed, and they started whispering to each other and pulling out their phones. They were expecting entertainment, but not the good kind, and they thought this disheveled old man was about to make a fool of himself, and they wanted to capture it on video. An older couple walking past also stopped to watch, and the woman leaned over to her husband and whispered something, and they both had small smiles on their faces, like they were watching something mildly amusing. More people began to notice, and a small crowd started forming, and most of them wore the same expression, and it was that look people get when they think they know exactly what is about to happen. They saw a homeless man about to embarrass himself on a public piano, and they were ready to watch and maybe laugh a little and then continue on with their busy, important lives. The man reached the piano and stood beside it for another long moment, and his hand reached out and touched the top of it gently, almost lovingly, like he was greeting something precious. Then he pulled out the bench and sat down, and the teenagers lifted their phones higher, and the crowd grew larger, and the security guard took a few steps closer just in case. Man placed his bag on the floor beside him, and then he just sat there looking at the keys, and his hands were resting in his lap, and he didn't move. 10 seconds passed, and then 20, and people started exchanging glances, wondering if he was going to play at all or if he had just sat down to rest. One of the teenagers snickered and said something to his friends, and they laughed, and an older man in the crowd shook his head like he was watching something sad, but the man at the piano didn't hear any of them because he was somewhere else entirely, and he was lost in memories that nobody in that station could possibly understand. His hands were trembling slightly, and if you look closely, you could see that his eyes were wet. And this wasn't just a man sitting at a piano, and this was a man facing his entire past. What nobody in that crowd knew was that those hands had once performed in some of the greatest concert halls in Europe, and they had played for audiences of thousands, and they had created music that brought people to tears. What nobody knew was that this man had once worn tailored suits and had his name printed in fancy programs and had bowed to standing ovations in Vienna and Paris and Berlin. What nobody knew was that he had spent 15 years trying to forget that he ever knew how to play, and that sitting at this piano was the hardest thing he had done in a very long time. His wife had loved to hear him play, and she would sit in their living room with her eyes closed and a peaceful smile on her face, and she said his music made her feel like everything in the world was exactly as it should be. When she got sick, he played for her every day, and when she passed away, he closed the lid on his piano and never opened it again because the music reminded him too much of her. After that, everything fell apart piece by piece, and the concert stopped and the money ran out and the house was sold and friends disappeared one by one until there was nothing left. He had spent years on the streets, invisible to everyone who walked past, and he had forgotten what it felt like to be seen and to matter and to have something to offer the world. But today, something had pulled him toward this old piano, and maybe it was her, and maybe she was telling him it was time to remember and time to play again. He lifted his hands slowly and placed them on the keys, and the ivory felt cool and familiar under his fingertips, and it was like coming home after being lost for a very long time. Crowd watched with their phones ready and their smirks in place, and they had no idea they were about to witness something that would change many of their lives. The security guard crossed his arms and waited for the inevitable moment when he would have to ask this man to move along and stop bothering the paying customers. The teenagers had their cameras rolling, expecting content they could post online to mock and laugh at with their friends later that night. The businessman, checking his watch, was annoyed that this little scene was blocking his path, and he just wanted to get to his platform and catch his train. The elderly woman holding her husband's arm felt a little sorry for the man at the piano, and she thought maybe she would give him some change when he was done. None of them were prepared, and not a single person in that station had any idea what was about to happen and how this ordinary afternoon was about to become extraordinary. The man took a deep breath and closed his eyes, and in that moment he wasn't in a train station anymore, and he was back in the concert hall, and he was back with his wife, and he was back in a life that had once been beautiful. And then his fingers began to move. First note rang out through the station, and it was soft and delicate, and it floated through the air like a whisper that somehow made everyone stop talking. The second note followed, and then a third, and suddenly the music began to pour out of that old beaten-up piano like water breaking through a dam. It was Chopin, and anyone who knew classical music would recognize it immediately, and it was one of the most difficult pieces ever written for piano, and it required years of training just to attempt. But this man wasn't attempting anything, and he was commanding that piano like it belonged to him, and like every single key was an extension of his own soul. The teenager who had been ready to laugh felt his smile fade from his face, and he lowered his phone slightly, and his mouth fell open just a little bit. His friends stopped whispering, and they just stood there frozen, because what they were hearing didn't match what they were seeing, and their brains couldn't make sense of it. Businessman who had been annoyed about missing his train forgot all about the train, and he set down his briefcase, and he just listened. The elderly woman grabbed her husband's arm tighter, and her eyes began to fill with tears because she had heard this piece performed before at a concert decades ago, and this was better. The security guard uncrossed his arms and took a step back, and the suspicion on his face melted away and was replaced by something that looked like wonder. More people stopped walking, and the crowd grew larger and larger, and soon there were 50 people gathered around, and then 100, The number kept climbing. Someone in the back stood on their toes trying to see who was playing, and when they saw the old man in the worn coat, their face showed pure disbelief. The music filled every corner of that massive station, and it bounced off the walls and the ceiling, and it reached people who were far away on distant platforms. A woman waiting for her train 3 platforms overheard it, and she walked toward the sound like she was being pulled by an invisible string. A janitor mopping the floor stopped what he was doing and leaned on his mop and closed his eyes and let the music wash over him. A little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve and pointed at the piano man and asked why everyone was standing so still, and her mother just whispered that they were listening to something special. The man's fingers danced across the keys with a speed and precision that seemed impossible, and his eyes remained closed, and his face showed every emotion the music contained. When the piece grew soft and tender, his whole body seemed to relax, and when it grew powerful and intense, he leaned into the piano like he was having a conversation with it. There were tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, but he didn't wipe them away, and he didn't stop playing, and the tears just fell onto his worn coat. A young woman in the crowd started crying too, and she didn't even know why, and she had never heard this piece before, but something about it broke her heart open. An old man who had been rushing to catch a train to visit his estranged daughter suddenly felt something shift inside him, and he pulled out his phone and called her right there. He told her he was sorry and that he loved her and that he was coming to see her, and she asked what had happened, and he said he had just heard something that reminded him what mattered. The teenagers had completely forgotten about making fun of anyone, and they were recording still, but now they were recording because they knew they were witnessing something rare. One of them had tears in his eyes, and he would never admit it to his friends, but in that moment he felt something he couldn't explain. The music swelled and grew, and it seemed to get bigger than the station itself, and people walking in from outside stopped at the entrance because they could hear it from the street. A taxi driver who had just dropped someone off heard it through the open doors, and he turned off his engine and got out of his car just to listen. The piano that had seemed old and broken was singing now, and it was like it had been waiting all these years for the right person to come along and wake it up. The man at the keys was no longer the homeless person everyone had seen when he walked in, and he had transformed into something else entirely. He was an artist and a master and a man pouring 15 years of silence and grief and loneliness into every single note. The pain of losing his wife was in there, and the shame of losing everything was in there, and the years of being invisible were in there too, but there was also hope woven through the music, and there was beauty, and there was a reminder that broken things can still create something magnificent. A music teacher in the crowd recognized the technique, and she knew immediately that this man had trained at the highest level, and she couldn't understand how someone like that had ended up here. She thought about all her students who practiced for hours every day hoping to become great, and here was greatness sitting in a train station, being ignored until this very moment. The piece moved into its final section, and the tempo increased, and the man's fingers flew across the keys so fast they were almost a blur. People held their breath without realizing it, and the whole station had gone completely silent except for the piano. And it was like time itself had stopped. The businessman felt tears on his own face, and he hadn't cried in 20 years, not even at his father's funeral, and he didn't know where this was coming from. The elderly woman was openly sobbing now, and her husband held her close, and he was crying too, and they had been married for 52 years, and music had always been their bond. The security guard wiped his eyes quickly, hoping no one would notice because he had a reputation to maintain, but he couldn't help it. The janitor had set down his mop completely and was leaning against a pillar with his hand over his heart. The little girl had stopped asking questions and was just staring at the old man with wide eyes full of wonder. The teenagers had put their phones down and were just watching, and one of them would later say, It was the most amazing thing he had ever seen in his life. And then the final notes came, and they were soft and gentle and heartbreaking, and they hung in the air, like a question that would never be answered. The man's hands lifted slowly from the keys, and he sat there with his head bowed and his shoulders shaking. And the last echo of the music faded into silence. For a moment, nobody moved and nobody spoke. And it was like everyone was afraid to break the spell that had fallen over them. Then someone started clapping, and it was just one person at first, and then another joined, and then another. And suddenly the entire station erupted in applause. People were cheering and whistling and stomping their feet, and it was the kind of ovation you hear at the greatest concert halls in the world. The man at the piano slowly opened his eyes and looked around at the crowd that had gathered, and his face showed complete shock. He had forgotten anyone was there, and he had been so lost in the music and the memories that he had forgotten he wasn't alone. The applause grew louder, and people were shouting for more, and some were pushing forward trying to get closer. To him, the teenager who had planned to mock him was now clapping harder than anyone else, and there was genuine admiration on his young face. The businessman walked forward and reached into his wallet and pulled out everything he had and placed it on top of the piano. Others followed his lead, and soon there was money piling up on the piano and on the floor around it, and people were giving whatever they had. But the man wasn't looking at the money, and he was looking at their faces, and what he saw there brought fresh tears to his eyes. He saw respect, and he saw admiration, and he saw recognition, and these were things he hadn't seen directed at him in 15 long years. For the first time in so long, he didn't feel invisible anymore, and he felt seen, and he felt human again. A woman pushed through the crowd, and she was holding her phone, and her face was excited, and she told him that she had recorded the whole thing. She asked if she could post it online, and he didn't really understand what that meant, but he nodded slowly. He had no idea that this simple nod would change everything, and that by tomorrow morning the whole world would know his story. Had no idea that his life was about to transform in ways he never could have imagined. All he knew in that moment was that his fingers remembered, and the music was still inside him, and maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. He looked down at his trembling hands and whispered 2 words so quietly that nobody else could hear them. Thank you. He wasn't talking to the crowd. That night the man slept under a bridge like he had done for years, and he had no idea that while he was trying to stay warm, something incredible was happening on the internet. The woman who recorded his performance had posted the video on social media with a simple caption that said, "Homeless man plays piano at train station, and what happens next will give you chills within." The first hour the video had 10,000 views, and by midnight it had crossed 500,000, and by the time the sun came up, it had reached 3 million people. All over the world were watching this old man in a worn coat sit down at a beaten-up piano and create something so beautiful it made strangers cry. Comments poured in from every corner of the globe, and people were asking, who is this man, and where did he come from, and how did he end up on the streets? Someone in Germany shared the video and wrote that they had never heard Chopin played with such raw emotion in their entire life. A woman in Japan watched it at 2 in the morning and woke up her husband so he could see it too, and they both sat in bed with tears running down their faces. A teenager in Brazil who had been thinking about quitting his piano lessons watched the video 7 times in a row and then went to practice for 3 hours. Straight news websites started picking up the story, and headlines appeared everywhere, saying mystery pianist stuns London train station, and the world wants to know his identity. Television producers were scrambling to find out who he was, and reporters were sent to the station hoping to track him down. But nobody knew where he had gone, because after he finished playing, he had simply picked up his small bag and walked away into the night. The money people had given him was enough for a warm meal and a cheap room for one night, but he didn't know about the room yet because he was already gone before anyone could tell him the same. way he had spent thousands of nights before shivering in the cold and wondering if anyone in the world remembered he existed. What he didn't know was that millions of people were now thinking about him and talking about him and searching for him back. In the train station the next morning, people were gathering around the piano taking photos of it like it was some kind of monumenta. Little boy asked his mother if the magic piano man would come back today, and she said she hoped so because she had missed him yesterday. The security guard who had watched the whole thing was being interviewed by a reporter, and he kept shaking his head, saying he had never seen anything like it in 20 years on the job. He described how the whole station had gone silent and how grown men were crying and how it felt like time had stopped for those few minutes. The video kept spreading, and by noon it had crossed 10 million views, and the comments section was filled with people sharing their own stories. One man wrote that he had been having the worst day of his life, and this video reminded him that beauty still exists in the world. A woman wrote that she had lost her mother last month, and watching this stranger play made her feel like her mother was somehow still with her. A retired music professor watched the video and immediately recognized the technique, and he knew this was someone who had trained at an elite conservatory. He started digging through old concert programs and music archives, searching for anyone who matched this man's description and age. After hours of research, he found something that made his heart skip a beat, and it was an old photograph from 30 years ago. The photo showed a young pianist taking a bow at a famous concert hall in Vienna, and the face was younger and healthier, but there was no doubt it was the same man. The professor's hands trembled as he read the name beneath the photo, and he discovered that this man had once been considered one of the finest pianists of his generation. He had won competitions across Europe and performed with legendary orchestras, and critics had called him a once-in-a-generation talent. But then around 15 years ago, he had simply vanished from the music world, and nobody knew what had happened to him. Professor posted his findings online, and suddenly the story grew even bigger, because now there was a name and a history and a mystery. People wanted to know what had happened and how someone so talented had ended up homeless and forgotten. Journalists started digging deeper, and they found old interviews and reviews and recordings of his performances from decades ago. They found stories about his wife, who had been a violinist, and how they had met at the conservatory and fallen in love over their shared passion for music. They found an obituary from 15 years ago announcing her death after a long illness, and suddenly things started making sense. People realized that this man hadn't just lost his wife, and he had lost his reason to play, and he had lost himself. The story spread even further, and now it wasn't just about a viral video, and it was about love and loss and healing power of music. Television news programs ran segments about him and played clips from his old performances. Alongside the train station video, famous musicians started sharing the video and adding their own tributes and calling him a master who deserved to be remembered. A renowned conductor who had worked with him 30 years ago gave an interview and said this man was one of the most gifted musicians he had ever encountered. He said it broke his heart to see what had become of him, and that the music world had failed. One of its own social media was flooded with the hashtag Find the Piano Man, and people all over London were keeping their eyes open, hoping to spot him. The woman who had recorded the original video was overwhelmed by what she had started, and she felt a deep responsibility to help find him. She printed out flyers with a screenshot from the video and the words, "Have you seen this man?" and she posted them all over the city. Shelters and soup kitchens were contacted, and volunteers spread the word among the homeless community. Meanwhile, the man himself had no idea any of this was happening, and he was sitting in a park feeding pigeons with crumbs from a stale piece of bread. He thought about the piano and how good it had felt to play again, and how for those few minutes he had felt alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. He thought about his wife and how proud she would have been, and how she always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. He wondered if maybe he should go back to the station and play again. But part of him was scared, because opening that door had let out so many emotions for 15 years. He had kept everything locked inside, and playing that piano had cracked him wide open, and he wasn't sure he could handle it. A pigeon landed on the bench next to him, and he smiled at it and said, "Well, at least you don't care if I used to be somebody." He had no idea that at that very moment a team of journalists was getting closer to finding him. He had no idea that a crowdfunding campaign had already raised over £50,000 to help get him off the streets. He had no idea that concert halls were calling the news stations offering to host a comeback performance. He had no idea that his life was about to change forever. All he knew was that the sun was setting and it was getting cold, and he needed to find somewhere warm to sleep. He stood up slowly, his joints aching from years of sleeping on hard ground, and he started walking toward the shelter on the other side of town. As he walked, he passed a newsstand, and something caught his eye, and he stopped and stared at the television screen in the window there. On the screen was a grainy image of a man sitting at a piano in a train station, and it took him a moment to realize he was looking at himself. His legs went weak, and he grabbed onto a lamppost to steady himself, and he watched as the news anchor talked about the viral sensation sweeping the world. Saw the numbers on the screen showing how many millions of people had watched the video, and his mind couldn't process what he was seeing. The world hadn't forgotten him after all. The world was looking for him and standing there on that cold street corner watching himself on television. He felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. He felt hope. He stood there frozen in front of that newsstand for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, as his reflection stared back at him in the glass. The face on the television screen looked like a stranger, and yet it was him, and was undeniably him playing that piano with tears streaming down his cheeks. A young man walking past noticed him standing there, and then looked at the screen, and then looked back at him, and his eyes went wide. The young man pulled out his phone and started recording, and he shouted to people passing by that he had found him and that the piano man was right. Here, within seconds, a small crowd began to form, and people were pointing and whispering, and more phones came out, and the man felt his chest tighten with panic. He had spent 15 years being invisible, and now suddenly everyone was looking at him, and it was overwhelming and terrifying. And he didn't know what to do. He tried to walk away, but people followed him, and they were calling out to him and asking if he was okay, and telling him how much his music had meant to them. A woman ran up beside him, and she was crying, and she grabbed his arm and told him that his video had saved her son's life. She said her boy had been in a very dark place and was thinking about giving up on everything. And then he watched the video and something changed in him. She said her son told her that if a man who had lost everything could still create something so beautiful, then maybe there was hope for him too. The man stopped walking and looked at this woman and her tears, and he felt something crack open inside his chest. He had thought his music died with his wife, but here was proof that it was still alive and still touching people and still making a difference. More people gathered around, and they weren't pushing or demanding anything, and they were just standing there with respect and admiration in their eyes. An older gentleman stepped forward and introduced himself as a reporter and asked if they could talk, and the man hesitated for a long moment. Part of him wanted to run and disappear back into the shadows where it was safe and where nobody expected anything from him. But another part of him remembered how it felt to play that piano and how it felt to be seen again, and that part one. He nodded slowly, and the reporter guided him to a nearby cafe and bought him a hot cup of tea and a warm meal. The cafe owner recognized him from the news and refused to let him pay for anything, and gave him the best table by the window as he ate his first proper meal in weeks. The reporter asked him to tell his story, and he found himself talking about things he hadn't spoken about in years. Talked about growing up poor and discovering the piano at a community center when he was 7 years old. and knowing immediately that this was what he was meant to do, he talked about practicing for hours every day while other kids played outside, and about teachers who recognized his gift and helped him get scholarships. He talked about the conservatory and how intimidated he felt at first, surrounded by students from wealthy families who had been training since birth. He talked about working twice as hard as everyone else, and about winning his first competition, and about the moment he realized he could actually make a living doing what he loved. And then his voice grew soft, and he talked about her and about the day he first saw her in the practice room next door, playing violin like an angel. He talked about falling in love and about getting married in a small ceremony with just a few friends, and about building a life together filled with music and laughter. He talked about the tours they did together and the concerts they played and the tiny apartment they shared that was always filled with the sound of practicing. His eyes filled with tears when he talked about the day she got sick and about watching her grow weaker month after month while doctors tried everything. He talked about playing for her every single day, even when she was too tired to open her eyes, and about how she would smile whenever she heard the first notes. He talked about the last time he played for her and how she squeezed his hand and told him to never stop making music because the world needed his gift. And then he talked about the day she left and how he closed the piano lid and couldn't bring himself to open it again. The reporter was crying now, and so was the cafe owner who had been listening from behind the counter, and so were several customers who had gathered nearby. He talked about losing the apartment because he couldn't work, and about selling everything they owned piece by piece until there was nothing left. He talked about the shame of asking for help, and about sleeping in shelters, and then on park benches, and eventually under bridges. He talked about becoming invisible, and about how people would look right through him, like he wasn't even there, and about forgetting that he had ever been someone. And then he talked about walking through that train station and seeing the piano and feeling something pull him toward it that he couldn't explain. He said it felt like she was there pushing him forward and telling him it was time to play again and time to remember who he was. The interview was published the next day, and it spread even faster than the original video, because now there was a story behind the music. People learned his name and his history and the tragedy that had brought him to that train station, and hearts broke all over the world. The crowdfunding campaign exploded, and within 48 hours, it had raised over £200,000, and donations were still pouring in. Messages came from everywhere, and famous musicians offered to help, and concert halls reached out wanting to host him. A charity that helped homeless people contacted him and offered him a small apartment where he could stay while he figured out his next steps. He walked into that apartment, and it was nothing fancy, just a single room with a bed and a small kitchen. But to him it felt like a palace. He sat down on the bed, and for the first time in 15 years, he slept in a real bed with clean sheets and a warm blanket. When he woke up the next morning, he thought for a moment that he was dreaming, but the sunlight coming through the window was real, and the soft mattress beneath him was real. There was a knock at the door, and when he opened it, he found a delivery man with a large item covered in a blanket. The man helped him bring it inside, and when he pulled off the blanket, his knees buckled and he had to grab the wall to keep from falling. It was a piano, and not just any piano, but a beautiful grand piano with gleaming black finish and perfect ivory keys. There was a note attached, and it was from a famous pianist who had watched the video and wanted to give him a gift. The note said that every artist deserves an instrument worthy of their talent, and that the world was waiting to hear him play again. He sat down at the bench and ran his fingers over the keys without pressing them, and he thought about his wife and what she would say if she could see this. Imagined her standing beside him with her violin tucked under her chin and that smile she always had when they were about to make music together. A tear fell onto one of the keys, and he wiped it away gently and took a deep breath. Then he began to play, and the music filled the small apartment and floated out the window into the street below. People walking by stopped and looked up trying to figure out where the beautiful sound was coming from, and somewhere in that music was a promise that he had finally found the courage to keep. He would never stop. Playing again. 6 months had passed since that cold afternoon in the train station, and the world had changed for him in ways he never could have imagined. He stood backstage at the Royal Albert Hall wearing a tuxedo for the first time in 2 decades. And his hands were trembling, but not from fear. The trembling came from the weight of the moment and from knowing that 5,000 people were sitting in those velvet seats, waiting to hear him play. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back at him, because this man looked healthy and strong and alive. His hair was neatly cut, and his face had filled out from proper meals, and there was a light in his eyes that had been missing for 15 years. A stagehand knocked on the door and told him it was almost time, and he nodded and took one more deep breath. Thought about the journey that had brought him here, and about all the people who had believed in him when he had stopped believing in himself. He thought about the woman who recorded the video and how one simple act of sharing had changed the course of his entire life. Thought about the strangers who had donated money and written letters and sent messages of support from every corner of the world. He thought about the young man in Brazil who had decided not to quit piano because of him, and about the mother whose son had found hope. He thought about the security guard and the businessman and the teenagers and all those people in the train station who had stopped to listen, and most of all, he thought about her and about the promise he had made to never stop playing, and about how proud she would be tonight. There was a small photograph tucked into his jacket pocket, right over his heart, and it was the only photo of her he had managed to keep through all those years on the streets. He touched it gently and whispered that this one was for her, and that he hoped she could hear him. Wherever she was, the stagehand returned and said it was time, and he followed the young man through the winding corridors of the historic concert hall. He could hear the murmur of the crowd growing louder as he got closer to the stage, and his heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He stopped just behind the curtain and closed his eyes and remembered the first time he had ever performed on a stage like this. He had been 23 years old and terrified, and she had been in the audience wearing a blue dress and smiling at him like he was the only person in the room. That memory gave him strength, and he opened his eyes and stepped out onto the stage. The moment the audience saw him, they rose to their feet, and the applause was thunderous and overwhelming. And it went on and on. He stood there in the spotlight with tears already forming in his eyes, and he bowed deeply to show his gratitude. The applause continued for nearly 5 minutes, and he had to gesture for people to sit down so he could begin. When the hall finally fell silent, he walked to the grand piano at center stage and ran his hand along its polished surface. This was the same model he had played in concert halls across Europe 30 years ago, and sitting down at it felt like coming home. He adjusted the bench slightly and placed his fingers on the keys, and the entire hall held its breath. And then he began to play the opening notes of Chopin's Ballade. Filled the magnificent space, and the sound was rich and warm and impossibly beautiful. It was the same piece he had played in the train station, but this time it was different, because this time he wasn't playing from grief alone. This time he was playing from gratitude and from joy and from a heart that had finally begun to heal. The music swelled, and the audience was completely transfixed, and some people had tears streaming down their faces before he even reached the second movement. In the front row sat the woman who had recorded the original video, and she was sobbing quietly into a handkerchief. Next to her sat the retired music professor who had identified him, and he was nodding along with closed eyes, savoring every note. The security guard from the train station was there too, wearing a suit for the first time in years, because he had to see this moment in person. The teenagers who had planned to mock him were somewhere in the middle section, and they had used their own money to buy tickets. The businessman who had cried that day in the station sat with his wife and daughter, and he had finally learned what truly mattered in life. The Elderly couple who had witnessed the performance were holding hands in the balcony and remembering 52 years of love and musical of these people whose lives had intersected with his for just a few minutes in a train station had come to witness his triumph. The music grew more intense, and his fingers flew across the keys with a passion and precision that left even seasoned critics speechless. He played like a man who had been given a second chance at life and who refused to waste a single moment of it. Played like a man who had walked through darkness and emerged into light and wanted to share that light with everyone who could hear. He played like a man saying thank you to the universe for not giving up on him, even when he had given up on himself. The piece built toward its climax, and the emotion in the hall was almost unbearable, and people were gripping the arms of their seats. And then came the final passage, soft and delicate and heartbreaking, just like it had been in the train station. But this time, when he played those last notes, he wasn't saying goodbye to anything, and he was saying hello to everything that was yet to come. Final note hung in the air for what felt like eternity, and then faded into perfect silence. For a moment nobody moved and nobody breathed, and the hall was completely still. Then the audience exploded, and they leapt to their feet. And the cheering was so loud it shook the chandeliers. People were shouting bravo and crying and hugging strangers next to them, and it was pure, unfiltered joy. Standing ovation lasted for 12 minutes and 3 times. He tried to leave the stage, and 3 times they called him back. Roses were thrown onto the stage, and he picked one up and held it to his chest, and thought of the woman who should have been here to share this moment. When he finally spoke into the microphone, his voice was rough with emotion, and he thanked everyone for giving him back his life. He said that 6 months ago, he was sleeping under a bridge, convinced that his story was over and that he had nothing left to offer. He said that one old piano in a train station had changed everything, and that music had saved him when nothing else could. He said that if anyone watching was going through dark times, he wanted them to know that it is never too late to start again. He said that broken things can still create beauty, and that forgotten people still have value, and that second chances are real if we are brave enough to take them. The audience was crying again, and this time they were tears of hope and inspiration and belief in the goodness of the world. He played 2 encores, and each one brought the audience to their feet again, and by the end of the night, his face hurt from smiling. After the concert, he was surrounded by wishers and journalists and fellow musicians who wanted to shake his hand, but he slipped away as soon as he could. Because there was somewhere he needed to be, he took a taxi to a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of the city and walked through the darkness until he found her grave. He sat down on the grass beside her headstone and told her about the concert and about the standing ovation and about how much he wished she could have been there. He told her that he finally understood why she made him promise to keep playing, and that she was right about the world needing his music. He told her that he would spend whatever years he had left making her proud and sharing the gift they had both loved so much. He told her that he would see her again someday, and that when he did, he would have so many stories to tell. And then he sat in silence for a long time, just being near her one more time. When he finally stood up, he looked at the stars and felt at peace for the first time in 15 years. The man who had been forgotten by the world had found his way back. The music that had died inside him was alive again, and somewhere in the night a gentle breeze stirred the leaves like soft applause from someone who had never stopped believing in him.